My husband vanished on the night of our 10th wedding anniversary, leaving nothing but signed divorce papers on our kitchen counter. 3 months later, I found him hauling cement at a muddy construction site in the pouring rain. When I finally cornered him, and he told me the real reason he walked away, my entire world shattered. My name is Maya, I am 34 years old, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of a luxury event planning company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to uncover a terrifying truth to protect yourself from the people you trusted most. I drove through the torrential downpour of the Atlanta storm, gripping my steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The private investigator I hired 3 months ago had finally sent me a location. It was an active commercial construction site on the muddy outskirts of the city. I parked my luxury sedan recklessly on the gravel shoulder, not caring that the heavy machinery was dangerously close. I stepped out of the car, and the thick red Georgia mud instantly ruined my designer shoes. I did not care. I marched straight past the chain-link fence and into the chaotic maze of scaffolding and wet concrete. Men in yellow hard hats yelled at me to leave the restricted area, but the rain drowned out their voices. I was on a mission. I was looking for the man who promised to love me for the rest of my life before he completely destroyed it. I spotted him near a massive pile of cinder blocks. Darius, my husband. He was wearing a cheap neon safety vest over a soaked gray shirt. He was hauling heavy bags of cement. His shoulders were slumped and he looked exhausted. This was a man who used to wear custom-tailored suits and work as a brilliant financial analyst. I stormed over to him, my heart pounding furiously against my ribs. I reached out and grabbed the back of his vest, yanking him around to face me. I knocked the yellow hard hat right off his head. It hit the wet mud with a dull thud. Darius staggered back and stared at me. His face was covered in dirt and rainwater. For a second, I saw a flash of absolute panic in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared behind a wall of cold indifference. I screamed at him, asking how he could do this to me. I demanded to know why he abandoned our home and left a ridiculous divorce document for me to find. Instead of apologizing or breaking down, Darius violently shoved my hands away from his chest. He took a step back and glared at me in front of the other laborers who had stopped working to watch us. He told me he left the divorce papers 3 months ago and asked why I had not signed them yet. His voice was completely devoid of any emotion. He told me to go back to my empty mansion. He said he was sick and tired of my fake corporate lifestyle and my endless ambition. He said he finally realized he did not want to be married to a woman who cared more about building her company than being a wife. His words felt like a physical blow to my chest. Standing there freezing in the rain, his cruel rejection threw me right back to the night my entire life fell apart. It was supposed to be our 10th wedding anniversary. I had left my office early and picked up a vintage bottle of wine and a custom-engraved watch for him. I walked into our home expecting to see candles and hear music. I expected to fall into the arms of the man who had supported me through every hardship. Instead, I walked into my dining room and found my mother Shirley and my older sister Keisha sitting at my table. They were casually drinking my expensive wine as if they were celebrating an achievement. Keisha had her designer boots resting comfortably on my white sofa. My mother did not even bother to greet me. She just looked at me with that familiar expression of disappointed disgust she had worn since I was a child. Growing up, my mother made it very clear that Keisha was the golden child. Keisha had lighter skin and loose curls, and she married a wealthy real estate developer named DeAndre. I was the darker-skinned daughter who was too stubborn and too loud. I had to build my own success from scratch, and they resented me for it. My mother slid a thick manila envelope across the marble counter toward me. She told me Darius was gone. She looked me right in the eyes and said the man I married finally realized he would never be good enough for our family. Keisha laughed and took a sip of my wine. She told me Darius took off. The second things got a little difficult because men like him could never handle a truly successful woman. My mother pushed the envelope closer to my hand. She told me the divorce papers were already drawn up and signed by him. She demanded that I sign them immediately. Then she added the real insult. She said I needed to grant DeAndre full power of attorney over my company finances because I was clearly too emotionally unstable to run a business after being abandoned. They looked so smug. They were practically thrilled that my marriage had failed because it proved them right. The memory faded as a loud crack of thunder brought me back to the muddy construction site. The rain was soaking through my clothes, but the anger burning inside me kept me warm. I refused to let Darius break me the way my mother and sister had tried to break me that night. I refused to be the pathetic, abandoned wife they desperately wanted me to be. I stepped closer to Darius, ignoring the mud splashing against my legs. I raised my hand ready to slap the cold indifference right off his face. I wanted to hurt him the way he hurt me. But as my hand flew forward, he raised his arms to block my strike, and I suddenly stopped. My eyes locked onto his hands. They were trembling. It was not a subtle shake from the freezing rain. His hands were vibrating violently, as if his entire nervous system was in shock. I looked closer at his knuckles. They were completely busted open. The skin was peeled back, and raw, bloody flesh was exposed to the heavy rain. Darius was not a fighter. He hated physical confrontation. He was a man who analyzed data for a living. He reached out to push me away again, but as he moved, his soaked gray shirt clung tightly to his torso. The thin, wet fabric revealed a thick, rigid outline underneath. It was bulky and strapped tightly across his ribs and chest. My breath caught in my throat. My hand hovered in the air. I reached out and pressed my palm flat against his chest. It was hard like heavy armor. Heavy. My husband, the financial analyst, was wearing a thick Kevlar bulletproof vest underneath his construction clothes. Everything inside me froze. The anger instantly evaporated and was replaced by a terrifying, chilling realization. This was not a man who walked away because he fell out of love. This was a man preparing for a war. I looked up into his eyes, and the cold facade he had put up seconds ago completely shattered. The anger and annoyance in his face vanished. It was replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. His lips trembled as he looked at me, and the reality of the situation crashed down on us both. I asked him what was going on. I demanded to know who did this to his hands and why he was wearing a bulletproof vest. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a single word, the loud crunching of heavy tires on wet gravel echoed over the rain. A massive black sports utility vehicle with heavily tinted windows aggressively rolled onto the construction site. It slammed on its brakes and completely blocked the main exit of the lot. Darius grabbed both of my shoulders. His grip was so tight it bruised my skin. He looked frantically at the black vehicle and then looked back at me. His chest heaved with panic. He leaned in close and screamed over the pouring rain, telling me that I should never have come looking for him. He said that if the men in that truck saw me talking to him, they were going to kill us both. He shoved me hard toward the scaffolding behind us and yelled at me to run and hide before the heavy doors of the vehicle opened. I stumbled backward into the shadows of the concrete pillars, just as the heavy doors of the black sports utility vehicle swung open. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pressed my back against the cold, wet concrete and held my breath. Two large men in dark raincoats stepped out of the vehicle. They did not look like construction managers or site supervisors. They walked with the heavy, deliberate strides of men who were used to using violence to get what they wanted. I watched through the narrow gap in the scaffolding as they approached Darius. They shoved him hard against the pile of cinder blocks. One of them grabbed him by the collar of his safety vest and got right in his face, shouting something I could not hear over the pouring rain. Darius kept his head down, playing the part of the submissive laborer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out there and fight them, but I remembered the pure terror in my husband's eyes. I remembered the bulletproof vest hidden under his shirt. If I stepped out there, I would only get us both killed. I forced myself to turn around and run. I slipped and stumbled through the thick red mud, tearing my clothes and scraping my knees until I finally made it back to my car. I locked the doors and drove away with my hands shaking so violently I could barely steer. When I finally reached the safety of my own driveway, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. It contained only 2 sentences. I am alive. Go to Sunday dinner tomorrow and pretend everything is fine. I knew it was Darius. I stared at the message for a long time. Going to my mother's house for Sunday dinner was the last thing I wanted to do. But if Darius was risking his life to uncover whatever horrific secret had torn our marriage apart, I had to play my part. I had to walk right into the lion's den and act like the broken, abandoned woman they all thought I was. The next afternoon, I pulled up to my mother's sprawling brick home in the upscale suburbs. The driveway was already packed with luxury cars, including my brother-in-law DeAndre's immaculate silver Mercedes. Taking a deep breath, I fixed my makeup, checked my reflection, and walked through the front door. The rich aroma of candied yams, baked macaroni and cheese, and fried chicken hit me immediately. It was the smell of Sunday tradition, but the warmth of the food was instantly countered by the freezing atmosphere in the living room. My mother, Shirley, was sitting in her plush armchair sipping a glass of iced sweet tea. Keisha sat next to her wearing a flawless silk blouse with her hair perfectly pressed. DeAndre stood by the fireplace holding a crystal glass of bourbon, looking like the picture of absolute corporate success. When I walked in, the conversation stopped. No one came over to hug me. No one offered me a plate. My mother looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the dark circles under my eyes that my concealer could not fully hide. She let out a heavy, theatrical sigh that filled the silent room. She told me I looked exhausted and that I was letting myself go. She said a woman in my position needed to maintain her appearance, especially now that I was completely alone. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a weak smile. I told her it had been a difficult few months. We moved into the formal dining room and took our seats around the large mahogany table. DeAndre led the prayer, thanking God for his booming real estate ventures and his beautiful, obedient wife. When we started eating, the ambush began. My mother did not even wait for me to finish my first bite before she launched her attack. She pointed her fork at me and told me she warned me about Darius from the very beginning. She said I never listened to her. She looked at Keisha and smiled proudly, then looked back at me with pure disdain. She told me I always had to be the loud, stubborn one. She said I was too dark, too aggressive, and too independent for my own good. She said men like Darius did not want a woman who worked 70 hours a week building an event company. They wanted peace. She told me I drove him away with my relentless ambition and my difficult attitude. Every word she spoke was a calculated strike designed to break my spirit. Growing up in our community, colorism was a toxic shadow that followed me everywhere. My mother had always worshipped Keisha's lighter skin and looser curls, treating her like a fragile princess who deserved the world. I was the darker daughter, the one who had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. I gripped my napkin under the table, digging my nails into my own palms to keep from screaming. I told my mother that Darius leaving had nothing to do with my skin tone or my ambition. I said we were simply going through a difficult transition. Keisha laughed, a sharp, condescending sound that echoed off the dining room walls. She placed her fork down and wiped her mouth with the linen napkin. She told me I was delusional. She said I was drowning in debt and pretending everything was fine while my husband was probably across the country with a woman who actually knew how to cater to his needs. She told me my little catering company was going to collapse without Darius there to handle the finances. My company's Soulful Heritage Events was my entire life. I built it from the ground up, securing massive corporate contracts and luxury weddings. But Keisha always referred to it as my little catering company, just to diminish my hard work. Before I could defend my business, DeAndre cleared his throat and set his bourbon glass on the table. He put on his best sympathetic smile. He looked at me with fake concern and said they were only being harsh because they loved me. He said family had to tell each other the hard truths. He told me the divorce was going to get messy and that my company assets were incredibly vulnerable. He said Darius could easily lay claim to half of everything I built and drag me through years of expensive litigation. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air before delivering the final blow. He said he had his legal team draw up a solution to protect me. Keisha reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stapled together. She slid them across the polished mahogany table until they hit my plate. I looked down at the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. It was a complete and irrevocable power of attorney. Keisha told me I needed to sign it immediately. She said DeAndre was a master at corporate asset protection and that he could hide my business accounts under his real estate umbrella so Darius could never touch a single dime. My mother nodded vigorously in agreement. She told me to stop being stubborn for once in my life and let a real man handle my messy situation. She said DeAndre was the only reason our family had any true respect in Atlanta, and that I should be grateful he was willing to clean up my mistakes. I stared at the documents, my mind racing back to the muddy construction site. I thought about the bulletproof vest strapped to my husband's chest. I thought about the sheer terror in his eyes and the text message telling me to play along. These documents had nothing to do with protecting me from a divorce. This was a hostile takeover. DeAndre and Keisha were trying to steal my entire company right out from under me. They wanted total control of my bank accounts, my vendor contracts, and my corporate identity. I realized with sickening clarity that they needed my company to move their dirty money. They were using my mother and her deep-seated colorism as a smokescreen to pressure me into signing away my life. I looked up from the papers and met Keisha's smug gaze. Then I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me expectantly. Finally, I looked at DeAndre, who was leaning back in his chair, playing the role of the benevolent savior. I felt a surge of absolute rage burn through my veins. I picked up the stack of papers and held them in midair. I told them I did not need DeAndre protection. I said I built soulful heritage events with my own two hands, and I would rather watch it burn to the ground than sign over control to anyone else. I grasped the top of the pages, preparing to rip the entire document straight down the middle. The smug smile vanished from Keisha's face. My mother gasped in outrage. But before I could tear the paper, DeAndre moved. He was incredibly fast for a man his size. He leaned across the table, grabbing my wrist with a grip so tight it felt like my bones were going to snap. He pulled me toward him, knocking over a crystal water glass that shattered against the floor. The charming corporate facade completely dropped away, revealing the cold, calculating monster underneath. His eyes were dead and completely void of any humanity. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. He lowered his voice to a dark, terrifying whisper that only I could hear over my mother's shocked gasping. He told me to sign the paper right now. He said if I tore that document or walked out of the room, he would make a single phone call. He whispered that if I did not give him exactly what he wanted, they would find my husband's body buried deep under the wet concrete of his new commercial plaza, and there would be nothing left for me to bury. I stared into DeAndre's dead eyes and felt a cold chill run down my spine. My hand shook violently as I picked up the heavy silver pen. The threat of my husband being buried under wet concrete echoed in my mind. I signed my name on the dotted line of the power of attorney document, giving them exactly what they wanted. Keisha immediately snatched the papers away with a triumphant smirk. While my mother praised me for finally being a reasonable woman, I felt sick to my stomach. I pushed my chair back and excused myself from the table, claiming I had a terrible migraine. I did not wait for their fake sympathy. I practically ran out of the house and got into my car. But I did not drive home. I drove straight back to the industrial area near the construction site where I had found Darius earlier that day. I parked my car behind a crumbling brick wall a few blocks away and waited in the fading daylight. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. Finally, I saw it. The same black sports utility vehicle that had terrified Darius rolled slowly down the street. I started my engine and kept my headlights off. I followed them from a safe distance, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sleek, expensive vehicle looked completely out of place as it turned into the cracked parking lot of a rundown motel on the desolate outskirts of Atlanta. The flickering neon sign cast an eerie red glow over the wet pavement. I parked across the street and watched. Two large men in dark raincoats got out of the vehicle and stood outside room number 12. They did not knock. They just stood there smoking cigarettes and watching the door for 10 agonizing minutes before getting back into their truck and driving away. They were keeping him under surveillance. I waited until their taillights disappeared into the night before I crossed the street. I walked up to the peeling green door of room 12. My mind was racing with horrible possibilities. Despite everything I had seen, a small part of me still wondered if he was hiding another woman in there. I balled my hand into a fist, but I did not knock. I raised my foot and kicked the flimsy door right near the handle with all the strength I had left. The cheap wood splintered loudly and the door flew wide open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. I stormed inside, ready to confront whoever or whatever was in there. But the room was completely empty of people. I stopped dead in my tracks, letting the door swing shut behind me. There was no other woman. There was no lingering scent of cheap perfume or shared wine glasses. The dingy little motel room had been completely transformed into a makeshift war room. The faded yellow wallpaper was entirely covered in printed spreadsheets, architectural blueprints, and photographs. Red yarn, pinned to the wall, connected offshore bank statements to fake vendor invoices bearing the logo of my company, Soulful Heritage Events. I stepped closer, feeling the air get thin. I recognized the signatures on the blown-up contracts. They were mine, but I had never signed them. I looked down. Sitting right on the cheap wooden nightstand next to a stack of manila folders was a loaded black Glock 19 handgun. It rested next to a spare magazine of hollow point bullets. A sudden movement in the dark corner near the bathroom made me jump. Darius stepped out into the dim yellow light. He was still wearing his wet construction clothes, but the tough exterior he tried to project earlier completely crumbled. He looked at the broken door frame, and then at me. He collapsed onto the edge of the sagging mattress and buried his face in his calloused hands. He started to cry with heavy, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. It was a sound of pure exhaustion and profound relief. I slowly walked over and sat next to him on the bed. I did not yell. I did not demand answers. I just put my hand on his back and asked him to tell me everything. Darius took a long, shaky breath and pointed at the massive web of documents on the wall. He told me that 3 months ago he started noticing massive discrepancies in my company accounts. He said huge amounts of cash were being funneled through Soulful Heritage Events to pay for catering supplies and floral arrangements that simply did not exist. Because he was a financial analyst, he knew exactly how to track the missing money. He dug deeper and realized Keisha had been using her familial access to my office to steal my corporate seals and forge my signature. She and DeAndre were using my legitimate, pristine business to wash millions of dollars for a violent local crime syndicate. They were taking the cartel's dirty money, passing it through my corporate accounts as fake luxury event expenses, and cleaning it through DeAndre's real estate development firm. Darius looked me in the eyes and said he confronted DeAndre about it on the afternoon of our 10th wedding anniversary. He had printed out all the proof and planned to show it to me that night over dinner. But DeAndre did not back down or deny it. Instead, DeAndre and 2 armed men ambushed Darius in the underground parking garage of his office building. Darius' voice cracked as he described the cold metal of DeAndre's gun pressing directly against his temple. DeAndre gave him a choice. He told Darius to pack his bags, file for divorce, and vanish without a trace, or he would kill me right in our own home and frame my dead body for the entire money laundering operation. DeAndre knew my forged signature was already all over the fake documents. If the authorities looked into it, I would look like the mastermind. DeAndre had the power to send me to federal prison for the rest of my life or put me in the morgue. Darius grabbed my hands and held them tight. He said he had to break my heart to save my life. He said leaving those divorce papers on the kitchen counter knowing it would destroy me was the hardest thing he ever had to do. But it was the only way to make DeAndre believe he had truly walked away and abandoned me. He knew DeAndre and Keisha would swoop in to play the heroes while secretly draining my company to finish their cartel contract. I sat there completely stunned as the sheer magnitude of my own family's betrayal washed over me. The colorism, the insults, the fake sympathy, it was all a calculated smokescreen. Keisha and my mother did not just hate me because I was dark-skinned and successful. They were actively setting me up to take the fall for a massive criminal enterprise while they reaped the millions. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom and my life to fund their luxurious lifestyle. I looked over at the loaded gun on the nightstand, and then back at my husband. I asked him why he was risking his life working as a manual laborer at DeAndre's construction site instead of taking all this evidence straight to the police. Darius shook his head and wiped the tears from his face. He explained that DeAndre paid off the local police precinct. He said the cartel had eyes inside the department, and going to the local cops would only get us killed before we even reached a detective's desk. He said the printed spreadsheets on the wall were not enough to trigger a federal investigation because they were just copies. He said he needed undeniable physical proof. He needed the master ledger. Darius explained that DeAndre was incredibly arrogant, but he was also deeply paranoid about technology. DeAndre kept a physical, handwritten ledger of all the cartel transactions, the bribes, and the real routing numbers hidden somewhere in the site manager's trailer at the new commercial plaza. Darius had infiltrated the construction crew as a lowly laborer, specifically to map out the security patrols, figure out the alarm codes, and find the exact location of DeAndre's hidden floor safe. He said he was so close to getting it. He just needed a few more days to secure the book so we could take it directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I squeezed his hands, realizing the incredible sacrifice this man had made for me. He gave up his career, his comfort, and our marriage just to keep me breathing. I told him we were going to finish this together. I told him I had already signed the power of attorney, but I was going to use it to blindside them. Before Darius could reply, a sharp metallic clicking sound echoed through the small room. We both froze. Someone was outside. The brass handle of the motel room door began jiggling violently. It was not a gentle knock. Someone was trying to force the lock open. Darius let go of my hands and lunged across the bed, grabbing the loaded Glock 19 from the nightstand. He pushed me behind him, aiming the weapon squarely at the splintering wood as heavy boots kicked against the frame. We had been found. The door frame groaned under the weight of the violent assault. The cheap wood began to cave in toward us. Darius did not hesitate for a single second. He raised the loaded Glock 19 and fired one warning shot right through the center of the splintering door. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed off the cramped motel walls, causing my ears to ring instantly. The men outside shouted in surprise and scrambled back from the entryway. That split second of hesitation from our attackers was all the time we needed. Darius grabbed my hand and yanked me into the tiny, cramped bathroom, slamming the hollow door shut behind us. He used the heavy metal butt of his gun to smash the frosted glass of the small window situated high above the bathtub. Shards of broken glass rained down into the porcelain tub. He hoisted me up by my waist and pushed me roughly through the jagged opening. I scraped my sides against the window frame, falling hard into the muddy alleyway behind the building. Darius dove out right after me just as a relentless barrage of bullets tore through the motel room wall, ripping the drywall to absolute shreds. We ran blindly through the pitch-black alley, slipping on wet garbage and splashing through deep, freezing puddles. The rain was relentless, but it perfectly masked the sound of our desperate, frantic footsteps. We did not stop running until my lungs burned and my legs felt like heavy lead. We finally reached the crumbling brick wall where I had hidden my car earlier that evening. I leaned against the cold, wet metal of my vehicle, gasping for air, while my heart threatened to beat right out of my chest. Darius checked the dark street corner to make sure we were not followed. He turned to me completely soaked and out of breath. He told me that DeAndre's men were getting incredibly sloppy because they were getting desperate. They knew he was getting too close to the hidden ledger. He grabbed my shoulders and looked deeply into my eyes. He said I had to go to work tomorrow morning and act exactly like the defeated, broken woman my family wanted me to be. If DeAndre suspected we had spoken, or that I knew anything about the cartel money laundering operation, he would accelerate his timeline, and we would both be dead before the week was over. I nodded, wiping the freezing rain and mud from my face. I realized we were entirely on our own, and I had to become the greatest actress in the world. The next morning, the Atlanta sun was bright and blinding, providing a sharp, sickening contrast to the nightmare of the previous night. I drove to the headquarters of Soulful Heritage Events, located in a prime downtown high-rise building. I built this company from a single folding table in my tiny apartment to a multi-million-dollar corporate enterprise. Stepping off the elevator onto my designated floor, the energy felt entirely wrong. The vibrant, bustling atmosphere was completely gone. My employees were gathered in small groups, whispering nervously to one another. When they saw me walking down the hall, they quickly looked down at their shoes, avoiding eye contact. My stomach twisted into tight, painful knots. I walked down the glass hallway toward my executive corner office. The heavy wooden door was wide open. Sitting comfortably behind my custom mahogany desk and my expensive leather chair was my sister, Keisha. Keisha was wearing a pristine white tailored suit that probably cost more than some of my employees made in an entire month. She was casually sipping her favorite organic herbal tea from my personalized coffee mug. Two large men in dark suits, who I immediately recognized as DeAndre's private security contractors, stood silently by the door with their hands crossed. Keisha looked up and offered me a sickeningly sweet, condescending smile. She told me she was genuinely surprised to see me show up today. She said she figured I would be at home crying in my bed over my ruined marriage. I stepped into the office and demanded to know what she was doing sitting behind my desk. She placed the mug down gracefully and tapped a thick stack of manila folders resting on the blotter. She reminded me about the power of attorney document I signed the night before. She said the document gave DeAndre total executive control over all corporate assets and personnel decisions, and he had officially appointed her as the interim chief executive officer to handle the daily operations. I walked over to the desk and snatched the top folder from the stack. It was a thick pile of termination notices. My blood ran completely cold as I read the printed names. Keisha had not just taken my office, she was actively gutting my entire company. She fired my lead floral designer, a brilliant black woman who had been with me since my very first wedding event. She terminated the contracts of all our local black-owned catering partners, the independent musicians, and the boutique event staff. She fired the exact people who gave Soulful Heritage Events its cultural soul. I looked at Keisha and asked her how she could destroy the livelihoods of hard-working people who trusted us. Keisha scoffed and rolled her eyes in annoyance. She said I was always far too emotional about business, and that was why I needed her help. She claimed she was cleaning up my mess and elevating the brand to attract a higher-tier demographic. She said my vendors were holding the company back with their urban aesthetic. But I knew the horrifying truth. I looked at the new vendor contracts stacked carefully on the corner of the desk. They were all newly registered corporate entities with vague names and absolutely no industry track record. They were DeAndre's shell companies set up specifically to process the dirty cartel cash. Before I could scream at her, my cell phone began to ring loudly inside my purse. I pulled it out and saw my mother Shirley was calling. I answered the phone, putting it on speaker so Keisha could hear every word. My mother did not even bother to say hello. She immediately launched into a calculated religious sermon designed to break my spirit and force my compliance. Her voice echoed through the quiet office, weaponizing her faith to justify their massive theft. She said the Lord was testing my pride, Maya. She told me I had become too arrogant and too obsessed with money, and this hostile takeover was God's way of humbling me. She said the Bible commands us to submit to righteous leadership, and that Keisha was simply stepping in as a dutiful sister to save me from my own spectacular failures. I listened to my own mother use the sacred language of the church to sanction a criminal cartel takeover. I told her Keisha was destroying everything I worked my entire life to build. My mother let out a sharp, disappointed clicking sound with her tongue. She said I was acting hysterical and entirely out of control. Then she delivered a psychological blow meant to shatter my core. She said I was acting exactly like my father did right before he abandoned our family. She said he was a weak, loud, and unstable man who could not handle the pressure of real success, and I was proving to be his exact replica. She told me to pack my things, go home, and pray for forgiveness while my sister handled the adult responsibilities. The line went completely dead. Keisha sat back in my chair, crossing her arms with a look of absolute triumph on her face. She asked me if I was going to throw a massive tantrum or if I was going to pack my bags quietly like a good little sister. I stood there looking at her smug face and the imposing security guards near the door. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to flip the heavy desk and fight her. But I remembered the terrifying crack of the gunshot at the motel. I remembered my husband bleeding in the rain and risking his life for me. I needed them to believe they had completely destroyed me. I needed them to feel arrogant and untouchable. So I forced my shoulders to slump forward. I let my breathing become ragged and erratic. I blinked hard, forcing hot tears to spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks. I let out a broken, pathetic sob that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Keisha smiled a genuine, cruel smile, thoroughly enjoying the sight of my absolute defeat. I walked over to the supply closet and pulled out an empty cardboard box. I began slowly packing the personal items off the bookshelves. I packed the framed photograph of my college graduation. I packed my glass industry awards. My hands shook visibly as I played the role of the shattered, abandoned woman. Keisha watched me with pure entertainment, sipping her tea and making condescending comments about how I would eventually bounce back if I learned to listen to my betters. I moved toward the mahogany desk to grab my favorite expensive silver pen resting near the edge. As I reached for it, my hand trembled deliberately, and I knocked the pen off the edge. It hit the carpeted floor and rolled underneath the heavy wooden desk. Keisha sighed loudly, complaining about my dramatic clumsiness. I dropped to my knees, crawling slightly under the overhang of the desk to retrieve the pen. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were suddenly perfectly steady. I reached into the hidden pocket of my blazer and pulled out a tiny flat black device no bigger than a shirt button. It was a high-frequency, microscopic audio-transmitting bug I had kept hidden in my emergency security kit at home. With a swift, silent motion, I peeled off the adhesive backing and pressed the device hard against the underside of the mahogany wood, directly above where Keisha's knees were resting. I grabbed the silver pen and stood back up, wiping the fake tears from my face. I placed the pen in my cardboard box and hoisted it into my arms. I looked at Keisha one last time, projecting nothing but absolute surrender. I turned and walked out of my own office, leaving her to rule her stolen kingdom. But as the elevator doors closed behind me, blocking their view, my tears instantly stopped. My posture straightened and my expression hardened into cold, solid steel. They thought they had buried me. The counterattack had officially begun. The elevator doors clicked shut, and the heavy silence of the metal box wrapped around me. I rode down to the underground parking garage and stepped into the humid Atlanta air. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car, but I did not start the engine. Instead, I reached into the center console and pulled out the small black receiver paired with the audio bug I had just planted under my desk. I placed the earpiece in my ear and turned the dial. Static hissed for a brief second before the crystal-clear audio of my own office filled my head. I could hear Keisha laughing. I could hear the clinking of her ceramic tea mug. Then I heard DeAndre enter the room praising Keisha for handling me so easily. He told her they only needed 3 more days to push the final $5 million through my vendor accounts before they completely drained the company and left me holding the bag. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. 3 days. That was our entire timeline. Later that night, the heavy rain from the previous evening had finally stopped, leaving the city cloaked in a thick, suffocating humidity. It was exactly midnight. Miles away at the commercial plaza construction site, Darius was making his move. He had spent the last 3 months memorizing the patrol routes of the armed security guards, and he knew they took a mandatory smoke break behind the heavy machinery at exactly midnight. Darius slipped out from his hiding spot near the concrete mixers. He moved silently through the thick red mud, keeping his body low to the ground. He approached the site manager's temporary office trailer, which sat elevated on cinder blocks near the edge of the property. The trailer was dark, but Darius knew what was hidden inside. He pulled a small metal tension wrench from his pocket and went to work on the cheap aluminum door lock. Within seconds, the lock clicked and he slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The air inside the trailer was hot and smelled like stale coffee and cheap cigars. Darius clicked on a small pen light, holding it between his teeth as he dropped to his knees. He moved straight to the heavy filing cabinet in the corner and pushed it aside with a soft grunt. Underneath the frayed carpet was a steel floor safe. He had watched the site manager punch in the code from a distance 2 days ago. His hands were shaking as he entered the 6-digit sequence. The heavy metal mechanism unlatched with a loud clunk. Darius pulled the heavy door open. Inside, resting on top of stacks of banded $100 bills, was a thick black leather-bound book and a small silver USB flash drive. This was it. This was the master ledger containing every single illegal transaction, every bribe, and every fake invoice tied to the cartel. Darius grabbed the flash drive and shoved it deep into his pocket. He pulled out his phone and started frantically snapping high-resolution photographs of the handwritten pages in the ledger, knowing he could not steal the physical book without immediately alerting DeAndre that the operation was compromised. He was on the 5th page when the metal steps outside the trailer suddenly groaned under massive weight. Darius froze. He killed the penlight and plunged the room into total darkness. The trailer door was violently yanked open. The hulking silhouette of the site foreman filled the doorway, blocking the only exit. The foreman was a massive, brutal man who acted as DeAndre's primary enforcer on the ground. He reached out and flipped the overhead fluorescent light switch, blinding Darius instantly. The foreman looked at the open floor safe and then looked down at Darius. A sick, twisted smile spread across his scarred face. He cracked his knuckles and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. There was no time for words. The foreman lunged forward like a freight train. Darius scrambled to his feet, but the massive man tackled him, driving his shoulders straight into Darius' ribs. They crashed through a flimsy wooden desk, sending blueprints and coffee mugs flying across the cramped room. Pain exploded in Darius' chest as he hit the floor hard. The foreman pinned him down and delivered a devastating punch straight to his jaw. Darius' vision blurred, and the taste of warm metallic blood filled his mouth. The man raised his fist to strike again, but Darius reached out blindly and grabbed a heavy metal stapler from the debris on the floor. He smashed it as hard as he could against the side of the foreman's head. The big man roared in pain and rolled off, clutching his bleeding temple. Darius scrambled backward, gasping for air, his ribs screaming in agony. He needed to get out. But the foreman was already pulling a black smartphone from his pocket. He was calling DeAndre. Darius knew if that call went through and DeAndre found out the safe was compromised, my life would end before sunrise. Pure adrenaline surged through Darius' veins. He launched himself off the wall and tackled the foreman around the waist. They slammed against the aluminum wall of the trailer, denting it outward. Darius grabbed the foreman's wrist with both hands, desperately fighting to keep the phone away from the man's ear. The foreman swung his free hand, punching Darius repeatedly in the ribs, trying to break his grip, but Darius refused to let go. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Darius twisted the foreman's arm backward and slammed the hand holding the phone onto the edge of the metal filing cabinet. He brought his elbow down violently, shattering the screen and crushing the internal components of the device into useless pieces of plastic and glass. The foreman howled in rage and kicked Darius hard in the stomach, sending him crashing backward through the trailer door. Darius tumbled down the metal steps and landed heavily in the mud. He did not look back. He clutched his bleeding side and sprinted into the darkness of the construction site, disappearing into the shadows before the foreman could draw his weapon. 30 minutes later, my burner phone vibrated on my nightstand. It was a single text with a set of coordinates. I grabbed my keys and my medical kit and sped through the empty streets of Atlanta until I reached the back parking lot of the historic African Methodist Episcopal Church in our old neighborhood. It was the only place we knew DeAndre's men would never patrol. The parking lot was completely empty except for the flickering glow of a single street lamp. I found Darius huddled behind the large brick donation bins. My heart stopped when I saw him. His face was covered in dark bruises, and a deep cut above his eye was bleeding profusely down his cheek. He was clutching his side, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. I dropped to my knees in the wet gravel and pulled him into my arms, tears stinging my eyes. He leaned his heavy head against my shoulder and pressed the small silver USB flash drive into my palm. He whispered that he got it. He said he got the proof we needed. I helped him into the back seat of my car and turned on the overhead dome light. I used antiseptic wipes to clean the blood from his face and applied butterfly bandages to the deep gash above his eye. Every time he winced, my hatred for my family grew stronger. Once I was sure he was stabilized, I climbed into the front seat and opened my laptop. My hands were trembling as I inserted the flash drive into the port. A folder popped up on the screen containing hundreds of scanned documents and the photographs he had just taken of the master ledger. I clicked on the first file labeled Corporate Loans. A high-resolution scan of a banking contract filled my screen. The document authorized a $5 million loan against the equity of Soulful Heritage Events. My eyes scanned down to the bottom of the page where the signature line was located. There it was. My name written in blue ink, but the loops of the letters were entirely wrong. The way the letter M slanted heavily to the right, the sharp, aggressive crossing of the letter T. It was not a professional forgery done by a stranger. It was a signature I had seen on birthday cards and holiday gifts my entire life. It was Keisha's distinct handwriting. I clicked through file after file, contract after contract. Keisha had personally forged my name on over $5 million worth of illegal cartel debt. My own sister had painstakingly practiced my signature sitting in her luxurious mansion, plotting exactly how she was going to ruin my life and send me to federal prison. The sheer cold-blooded malice of it was almost impossible to process. She did not just hate me, she wanted me completely erased from the world. Darius leaned forward from the back seat, resting his chin on my shoulder. He looked at the glowing screen and said we finally had enough evidence to go to the police. He told me we needed to drive to the local precinct right now before the foreman managed to contact DeAndre and warn him. But I slammed the laptop shut and shook my head. I told him we could not go to the Atlanta police. I remembered the charity events DeAndre constantly hosted for the local police chief. I remembered the expensive golf trips they took together. The local precinct was deeply compromised. If we walked into a station house with this flash drive, it would disappear into an evidence locker, and we would be arrested for corporate espionage before the sun came up. We needed someone completely outside of DeAndre's sphere of influence. We needed devastating, untouchable federal power. I reached for my cell phone and opened my contacts. My thumb hovered over a name I had not called in years. It was my line sister from my college sorority. We had pledged together, survived the brutal late-night initiation processes together, and formed a bond thicker than blood. She was now a senior special agent working at the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Washington. I pressed the call button and pressed the phone to my ear. It rang 3 times before she answered with a sharp professional greeting. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice against the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I told her I was sorry for calling so late, but I needed her help. I told her I had definitive proof of a massive money laundering operation tied to a local cartel, and I needed her to bring the full weight of the federal government down on my own family. I told my sorority sister everything. I told her about the forced divorce, the bulletproof vest, the construction site, and the millions of dollars Keisha had forged in my name. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then she asked me if I had the physical evidence. I told her I had high-resolution scans of DeAndre's entire master ledger on a flash drive. She let out a low whistle and told me that this cartel was currently the Federal Bureau of Investigation's top priority in the Southeast region. She said they had been trying to build a case against DeAndre for 2 years, but he always kept his hands clean. Now I had just handed them the smoking gun. But she warned me that making an arrest based on digital copies would take weeks to process through the federal court system, and during that time, DeAndre could easily destroy the original ledger and eliminate Darius and me. We needed to catch them completely off guard. We needed to orchestrate a situation where DeAndre and Keisha would willingly gather all their associates and confess their crimes in a public setting where they could not escape. I looked at Darius, who was resting with his eyes closed. I told her I knew exactly how to set the trap. The next morning, I put my plan into motion. I drove my car to a busy coffee shop down the street from my corporate office. I sat in my car and pulled out the small black receiver to listen to the audio bug I had planted under my desk. Keisha was already in my office complaining loudly to her assistant about the catering menu for an upcoming event. I waited until I heard the assistant leave the room and the heavy wooden door click shut. Keisha was completely alone. This was my window. I picked up my burner phone and dialed the main line of my own office. Keisha answered on the second ring using her sickly sweet professional voice. She said, "Soulful Heritage Events Interim Chief Executive Officer Keisha speaking." I immediately launched into my performance. I made my voice sound incredibly frantic and panicked. I told her she had to listen to me and that I had made a massive mistake. I told her I accidentally forwarded a highly confidential email to her assistant instead of my personal lawyer. Keisha laughed a sharp, condescending sound. She asked me what could possibly be so confidential about my ruined little company. I lowered my voice to a desperate whisper. I told her that before Darius left, he had been in secret negotiations with a massive international hospitality conglomerate based in London. I said they had spent months auditing my brand, and they loved our market position. I paused, making sure she was listening closely. Then I dropped the bait. I told her they formally offered to buy Soulful Heritage Events for $25 million in cash, and the final contract was supposed to be signed this Friday. I begged her to delete the email and not tell DeAndre. I said that money was my only chance to start over, and that if DeAndre knew about the buyout, he would use his power of attorney to steal the entire $25 million. The line went completely silent. Through the audio bug receiver in my other ear, I could hear Keisha physically gasp. I heard her chair squeak as she sat up straight. Then she hung up the phone on me without saying a single word. I smiled a cold, hard smile. The bait was set. I kept the receiver pressed to my ear. Less than a minute later, I heard Keisha dialing her cell phone frantically. She called DeAndre. Her voice was shaking with pure, unadulterated greed. She told him exactly what I had said. She told him there was $25 million sitting on the table just waiting to be claimed. DeAndre was silent for a moment, processing the information. Then he started laughing. It was a dark, greedy laugh. He told Keisha this was the perfect exit strategy. He explained that they could sign the corporate buyout on Friday, take the $25 million in cash, and immediately transfer it to their offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He said they could pay off the cartel debt with a fraction of the money and keep the rest for themselves. He said they would leave the country by Saturday morning, leaving me holding the empty shell of a company drowning in federal investigations. They were blinded by the promise of massive wealth, exactly as I knew they would be. Later that afternoon, I was sitting in my living room going over the final details of the sting operation with my sorority sister via encrypted text messages. A loud, aggressive knock on my front door startled me. I quickly hid my phone and opened the door. It was my mother, Shirley. She pushed past me without an invitation and walked directly into my living room, carrying a large plastic garment bag. She dropped it unceremoniously onto my sofa. She looked around my house with a look of utter disgust, as if my recent failures had somehow physically stained the walls. I asked her what she was doing here. She crossed her arms and told me she came to drop off my outfit for the upcoming church charity gala on Friday night. The church charity gala was the most important social event of the year for the affluent Black community in Atlanta. It was where deals were made, reputations were cemented, and social hierarchies were strictly enforced. My mother unzipped the plastic bag to reveal a cheap drab olive green dress. It looked like something you would buy off the clearance rack at a discount department store. It was shapeless, dull, and entirely humiliating. She pointed at the ugly garment and told me I was going to wear it on Friday. She said Keisha was wearing a custom couture gown flown in from Paris because Keisha was the glowing face of our family's success. She looked me up and down and said I needed to look the part of a humble, grieving woman who was grateful for her family's charity. She said I was not allowed to wear any of my designer clothes or my expensive jewelry because it would send the wrong message to the congregation. She wanted me to physically embody the role of the defeated scapegoat so Keisha could shine even brighter. She stepped closer to me, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. She told me DeAndre was going to make a massive business announcement at the gala in front of the mayor, the city council, and all the elite families. She said he was officially going to announce the sale of my company. She demanded that I stand in the background, keep my mouth shut, and let my sister have her moment of glory. She said if I tried to cause a scene or embarrass Keisha, she would personally make sure I was exiled from the community forever. I looked at the ugly green dress lying on my expensive sofa. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who was actively participating in my destruction just to elevate her lighter-skinned daughter. A few days ago, her words would have crushed me, but now I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I reached out and gently touched the cheap fabric of the dress. I looked my mother right in the eyes and offered her a deadpan, completely emotionless smile. I told her the dress was perfect. I said I would wear exactly what she wanted me to wear, and I would stand exactly where she told me to stand. I promised her that Friday night would be a gala the family would never forget. My mother looked slightly unnerved by my calm compliance, but her arrogance quickly took over. She smirked, told me to fix my hair before Friday, and walked out of my house. She had no idea she had just walked right into the center of the trap. The stage was set for the greatest public reckoning our family had ever seen. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity that clung to the Atlanta skyline. I pulled my car up to the grand entrance of the historic First Fellowship Church. The sprawling luxury banquet hall attached to the main sanctuary had been completely transformed for the annual charity gala. Valet attendants rushed back and forth, opening the doors of expensive foreign sports cars and massive luxury sports utility vehicles. The entire black elite of the city had gathered for this highly anticipated event. There were powerful local politicians, wealthy real estate moguls, influential megachurch pastors, and corporate executives all dressed in their absolute best. I stepped out of my car feeling the immediate abrasive scrape of the shapeless olive green dress against my skin. It was exactly as hideous as my mother intended it to be. The cheap synthetic fabric hung loosely off my frame, making me look completely washed out and utterly defeated. As I walked up the marble steps and entered the grand foyer, the sensory overload hit me instantly. The room was bathed in the warm golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. But the sheer opulence of the room made me sick to my stomach. I looked at the towering floral centerpieces and the imported silk drapery, and I knew exactly how it was all paid for. It was paid for with the dirty cartel cash that Keisha and DeAndre had ruthlessly laundered through my stolen company. I stood near the edge of the room, blending into the shadows, as the elite crowd mingled and laughed. Directly in the center of the room, holding court like a king, was DeAndre. He wore a flawless midnight blue velvet tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He was flashing his charismatic million-dollar smile, shaking hands with the mayor, and clapping the city council members on the back. He was playing the role of the generous community philanthropist to absolute perfection. I watched him hand a massive, oversized novelty check to the head pastor, supposedly a donation to the new youth center. The crowd erupted into polite applause. It was a brilliant, terrifying facade. He was using the sanctity of the church and the trust of our community as a bulletproof shield for his criminal empire. He looked so comfortable, so entirely untouchable, knowing that by tomorrow morning he would be sitting on a beach in the Cayman Islands with $25 million while I faced federal prison. The string quartet playing in the corner of the room suddenly shifted their tempo, playing a grand sweeping melody to signal the arrival of the evening's most important guests. The heavy mahogany doors at the top of the grand staircase opened, and a collective gasp rippled through the banquet hall. My sister Keisha stood at the landing looking down at the crowd like royalty. My breath caught in my throat and the blood roared in my ears. I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her cruelty. She was not just wearing custom couture, she was wearing a stunning, expertly altered version of my actual wedding dress. It was the custom silk gown I had worn 10 years ago when I married Darius. She had hired a designer to shear away the long sleeves, plunge the neckline, and dye the pristine white fabric a soft, shimmering champagne color. But I recognized the intricate hand-stitched French lace on the bodice. I recognized the unique pearl beading along the hem. It was my dress. The dress I had carefully preserved in a box in the back of my closet. She had broken into my home, stolen my most sacred memory, and butchered it to wear as a trophy. Keisha slowly descended the staircase, her arm linked with my mother Shirley. My mother was beaming with a sickening level of pride, wearing a diamond necklace that I was certain DeAndre had purchased with my company funds. Keisha glided through the crowd, accepting compliments from the wealthy wives of the politicians. I heard her laugh gracefully and tell a group of women that the dress was a rare vintage find from a private estate sale in Paris. It was absolute psychological warfare. She wanted me to look at her and see the total destruction of my marriage, my business, and my life draped across her body. My mother tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute, demanding the attention of the massive room. The chatter died down, and the guests turned toward the center of the hall, where my mother stood next to Keisha and DeAndre. My mother raised her glass, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked directly onto me, hiding in the corner in my cheap green dress. Her lips curled into a vicious, triumphant smirk. She projected her voice so it echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She thanked everyone for coming to celebrate the blessings of the community. Then she placed her hand on Keisha's shoulder. She announced that she wanted to make a special toast to a couple who truly embodied the values of success, faith, and family. She called DeAndre a visionary leader and a true savior to our family. Then she looked right at me again. She raised her glass higher and declared that she was so incredibly proud of Keisha. She called Keisha the only daughter who had truly brought honor and respect to the family name. She said that in times of unexpected family tragedy and shameful personal failure, it was Keisha who stepped up with grace to clean up the mess and protect the family legacy. The underlying message was brutally clear to everyone in the room. The guests turned their heads to look at me. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes burning into my skin. The room filled with hushed whispers and fake sympathetic murmurs. I heard the sharp, biting gossip floating through the air. They whispered about how my husband had completely abandoned me. They whispered about how my company was failing, and how my brother-in-law had to swoop in to save me from total bankruptcy. They looked at my drab clothing and my unstyled hair, and they pitied me. I was completely isolated, standing on an island of public humiliation while my family basked in the stolen glory. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to march to the center of the room, grab the microphone, and expose them right then and there. I wanted to scream that the dress was stolen and the money was soaked in cartel blood, but I forced my feet to stay planted to the floor. I took a slow, deep breath and let the humiliation wash over me. I had to endure this. Underneath the cheap fabric of the olive green dress taped securely against my ribs was a high-tech federal wiretap device provided by my sorority sister. Several of the catering staff walking around the room carrying trays were undercover Federal Bureau of Investigation agents. The trap was already set. I just needed DeAndre to make the official announcement of the $25 million sale. I needed his confession on the public microphone. I broke eye contact with my mother and walked quickly toward the quiet corridor that led to the restrooms, trying to escape the suffocating stares of the congregation. The hallway was dimly lit and empty. I leaned against the cool plaster wall, closing my eyes and trying to steady my racing heart. Suddenly, a heavy hand slammed flat against the wall right next to my head, trapping me. I gasped and my eyes snapped open. DeAndre was standing inches away from my face. The charming, philanthropic smile he had been wearing all night was completely gone, replaced by a look of pure psychopathic menace. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the smell of dark liquor made my stomach churn. He leaned his massive frame into my personal space, pinning me into the corner where the security cameras could not see us. He told me I was doing a fantastic job playing the pathetic victim. He said he was almost proud of how well I was taking the humiliation. I glared at him and told him to back away from me. I told him I signed his papers and I attended his stupid gala, so he had no reason to touch me. DeAndre chuckled, a low, vibrating sound deep in his chest. He reached into his velvet tuxedo jacket and pulled out his sleek black smartphone. He told me he just wanted to make sure I stayed motivated for the rest of the evening. He unlocked the screen and held the phone up right in front of my face. My blood ran absolutely cold. It was a live video feed. The camera was zoomed in on the window of a cheap motel room on the other side of Atlanta. Through the glass, I could clearly see Darius. He was pacing back and forth in the small room, holding a cell phone to his ear, looking stressed and exhausted. Then my eyes focused on the center of the screen. Directly over my husband's chest was a glowing red laser dot. It was the laser sight of a high-powered sniper rifle. DeAndre watched the horror register on my face, and his smile widened into a terrifying grin. He whispered that his associate was stationed on the roof of the building directly across from Darius's new hideout. The sniper had a clean line of sight right through the thin motel window. DeAndre explained that his man had his finger resting firmly on the trigger, just waiting for a single text message command. DeAndre grabbed my jaw with his free hand, his fingers digging painfully into my cheeks. He leaned in so close his lips brushed against my ear. He told me that in exactly 10 minutes he was going to walk up to the main stage and announce the $25 million buyout of Soulful Heritage Events to the entire city. He said he was going to call me up to the stage and I was going to smile for the cameras, thank him for his guidance, and sign the final transfer documents in front of the mayor. He told me if I hesitated for a single second, if I cried, if I tried to argue, or if I refused to sign, he would send the text message. He released my jaw and took a step back, adjusting his velvet lapels as if nothing had happened. He looked at me with dead, soulless eyes and delivered his final absolute ultimatum. He told me to smile for the cameras and sign the sale papers tonight, or my husband's brains would paint the motel wall. He turned on his heel and walked back out into the glittering lights of the banquet hall, leaving me alone in the dark corridor, fighting to breathe. I stood alone in the dark corridor, fighting to breathe. The image of that glowing red laser dot resting directly over my husband's chest was burned into my retinas. My chest heaved and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. DeAndre had found Darius. The entire meticulously planned federal sting operation was completely unraveling in a matter of seconds. I pressed my trembling hands against the cool plaster wall, trying to ground myself. Panic threatened to pull me under, but I violently shoved it down. My sorority sister had warned me that tracing a live burner phone signal and deploying a tactical unit to secure a remote perimeter took time. Federal agents moved with precision, but they could not teleport. 10 minutes was not enough time to save my husband. If DeAndre walked onto that stage and commanded me to sign those papers before the Federal Bureau of Investigation neutralized the sniper, Darius would be executed. I had to stall him. I had to keep him in this isolated hallway where the deafening music of the banquet hall could not mask his voice. I had to keep his massive, fragile ego engaged so he would forget about the time. I pushed myself off the wall and sprinted silently down the carpeted hallway. DeAndre was just a few feet away from the heavy mahogany doors that led back into the glittering gala. I reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his expensive velvet tuxedo, yanking him backward with all the strength I had. He spun around, his eyes flashing with sudden, violent irritation. He raised his hand as if he was going to strike me right there in the corridor, but I did not flinch. I stepped directly into his personal space, tilting my head and forcing a loud, mocking laugh. I asked him if he really thought $25 million was going to be enough to buy his way out of being a pathetic fraud. His hand froze in midair. The charming philanthropic mask he wore for the congregation completely slipped, revealing the deeply insecure man underneath. He narrowed his eyes and asked me what I was talking about. He told me to keep my voice down and remember who held my husband's life in the palm of his hand. But I did not lower my voice. I pushed harder, deliberately poking at the deepest insecurities of a man obsessed with status. I told him he was nothing but a glorified errand boy for a violent cartel. I said the entire community looked at him and saw a wealthy real estate mogul, but I looked at him and saw a desperate, terrified little man who was drowning in debt. I told him I knew all about his failed commercial properties before he married my sister. I said he did not marry Keisha because he loved her. He married her because she was the easiest target in a family desperate for validation, and he needed her pristine credit score to keep his failing business afloat. DeAndre took a menacing step forward, forcing me to back up against the wall, but I kept talking. I let the venom drip from every single word. I asked him how it felt to know he could never build anything of his own. I built Soulful Heritage Events from a single folding table into a multi-million-dollar empire with my own sweat and tears. I told him he was entirely incapable of creating genuine wealth, so he had to steal mine like a common street thief. I asked him how it felt to look in the mirror and know he could never be half the man Darius was. I said Darius was willing to work in the freezing rain and take a brutal beating to protect his family, while DeAndre hid behind a hired sniper and a tailored suit. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would shatter. The veins in his neck bulged against his crisp white collar. DeAndre hated being questioned. He hated being emasculated, especially by a dark-skinned woman he viewed as entirely beneath him. He grabbed my shoulders and slammed me hard against the plaster wall, knocking the breath from my lungs. But I smiled at him. I smiled a cold, defiant smile that told him I was not afraid. I told him he was stupid if he thought his plan was actually going to work. I said federal auditors were not idiots. I told him a bunch of fake vendor contracts and a forged signature would never hold up under a real corporate investigation. I said the second the international conglomerate finalized the buyout, they would tear his financial records apart and find the cartel money. I called him a sloppy amateur who was going to get us all killed. That was the breaking point. His massive ego simply could not tolerate being called an amateur. He needed to prove he was the smartest man in the room. He needed to prove he was a criminal mastermind who had outsmarted everyone. DeAndre leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his angry breath on my face. He told me I was the stupid one. He said I had absolutely no idea how brilliant his operation was. He spat the words at me, his voice vibrating with absolute rage. He explicitly detailed everything. He said he did not just forge a few documents. He said my sister Keisha sat at his dining room table for 3 agonizing weeks practicing my signature until it was absolutely flawless. He bragged about how she forged my name on the primary bank authorizations, securing $5 million of illegal loans against my corporate equity. He did not stop there. He wanted me to know the exact depths of my own ruin. He explained how he set up 7 different shell companies registered in Delaware, specifically designed to look like boutique floral and catering vendors. He said he funneled the cartel's dirty cash through those shell companies directly into my business accounts and then routed the clean money straight to his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He said he intentionally left my name and my social security number on every single primary ledger. He laughed a dark, vicious laugh and told me the cartel did not care who went to federal prison as long as their money was clean. He said when the authorities finally raided Soulful Heritage events, they would find my signature on every piece of damning evidence, and he would be sitting on a tropical beach untraceable and untouchable. I gasped, pretending to be entirely overwhelmed by his brilliant cruelty. I begged him to stop, but my pleading only fueled his arrogant rant. He bragged about the night of my 10th wedding anniversary. He said holding a loaded gun to Darius's head in that underground parking garage was the easiest thing he ever did. He said Darius cried like a coward and agreed to file for divorce just to keep me breathing. DeAndre told me he orchestrated the entire narrative of the abandoned wife, specifically so my mother and Keisha would eagerly step in and force me to sign over the power of attorney. He said he weaponized my mother's deeply rooted colorism to isolate me perfectly. He laid out the entire criminal conspiracy piece by piece, date by date, dollar by dollar, fueled entirely by his massive, fragile ego. He released my shoulders and smoothed the lapels of his velvet tuxedo. He looked down at me with absolute contempt. He told me the trap was flawless, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to escape it. He checked his heavy gold watch and told me the 10 minutes were up. He ordered me to wipe my face, walk out to that stage, and sign my company away, or he was sending the text message to the sniper. I kept my face locked in an expression of terrified submission. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, playing the part of the completely broken victim, but internally my heart soared. My pulse pounded with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. I did not need to escape his trap because he had just walked directly into mine. Underneath the collar of my cheap olive green dress taped securely against my collarbone was a microscopic high-frequency wiretap. It was broadcasting his entire explicit confession in crystal-clear high-definition audio directly to the federal agents waiting in the unmarked vans parked right outside the church doors. He had just confessed to money laundering, wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder on a live federal recording. Just as DeAndre turned his back to walk toward the banquet hall, my burner phone vibrated in the hidden pocket of my dress. It was a single sharp buzz. I reached into my pocket under the guise of smoothing the cheap fabric. I pulled the phone out slightly, shielding the glowing screen with the palm of my hand. It was a text message from my sorority sister at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It contained only 2 words: green light. The sniper on the roof across from the motel had been located and successfully neutralized by a federal tactical team. Darius was safe. The threat was entirely eliminated. A wave of absolute power washed over me. The fear, The humiliation, the months of psychological torture, all of it evaporated into thin air. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back. I reached up and casually touched the small diamond stud resting in my left ear, adjusting it slightly. It was the signal to the federal agents outside that I understood the message, and the primary target was moving toward the main stage. I looked at DeAndre's back as he confidently pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped into the blinding lights of the charity gala. He thought he was walking to his ultimate victory. He thought he was about to steal $25 million and destroy my life forever. I followed right behind him, stepping out of the shadows and into the light. I was not hiding anymore. The game of survival was officially over. The execution had begun. I followed DeAndre back into the blinding lights of the grand banquet hall. The transition from the dark, quiet corridor to the deafening roar of the charity gala was jarring, but my mind had never been clearer. The room was packed with over 300 of the most influential people in the city. The mayor was sitting at the front table, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. Powerful investors and mega-church pastors were laughing and mingling, completely unaware that they were standing in the middle of an active federal sting operation. DeAndre did not waste a single second. He walked with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire world. He marched directly past the floral centerpieces and climbed the steps to the main stage. He tapped the microphone twice. The sharp feedback echoed through the vaulted ceilings, instantly cutting through the chatter. The string quartet stopped playing. 300 faces turned toward the stage. DeAndre smiled his brilliant, fake philanthropic smile. He welcomed everyone to the gala and thanked them for their generous donations to the church. Then his voice took on a solemn, theatrical tone. He began to talk about the importance of family. He spoke about generational wealth and Black excellence spinning a beautiful lie for the elite crowd. He told them that sometimes family meant stepping in to carry the burden when someone you love stumbles and falls. He gestured grandly toward the corner of the room where I was standing. He announced that his sister-in-law Maya had recently gone through an incredibly tragic personal hardship. He looked out at the audience with fake sympathy in his eyes, telling them that my husband had abandoned me and left my business vulnerable. The crowd murmured collectively, shaking their heads in pity. I could feel their eyes burning into my cheap olive green dress. DeAndre raised his voice, silencing the whispers. He declared that family never leaves family behind. He announced that his real estate development firm had stepped in to manage my corporate assets and that tonight they were finalizing a historic deal. He proudly proclaimed that an international hospitality conglomerate was officially acquiring Soulful Heritage Events for $25 million. The banquet hall erupted into thunderous applause. People were cheering for him. They were clapping for the man they thought was the ultimate protector and a brilliant businessman. My mother Shirley was sitting at a VIP table near the front, wiping a fake tear from her eye and nodding proudly. DeAndre waved his hand, signaling for me to join him. He asked me to come up to the stage to sign the final acquisition documents right there in front of the entire community as a testament to our unbreakable family legacy. I forced my shoulders to slump. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, playing the role of the defeated, broken woman right until the bitter end. I slowly walked through the parted crowd. I could hear the wealthy wives whispering as I passed them. They whispered about how completely exhausted I looked, and how lucky I was to have a brother-in-law willing to bail me out of my massive failures. I ignored every single word. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the main stage. A sleek mahogany table was quickly rolled out to the center of the platform. Resting perfectly in the center of the table was a thick stack of legal documents. It was the absolute culmination of their entire criminal conspiracy. This was the exact paperwork that would officially transfer my company to their shell corporations, allowing them to steal the $25 million, pay off the cartel, and disappear forever, leaving me to face the federal authorities. Keisha stepped up to the table. She looked absolutely radiant in my stolen, altered wedding dress. The shimmering champagne silk caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, making her look like an angel. But her eyes were pure, concentrated venom. She picked up a heavy silver fountain pen from the desk. She held it out to me. Her perfect manicured fingers brushed against mine as she pressed the cold metal into my palm. She leaned in close, plastering a bright, beautiful smile on her face for the cameras flashing in the audience. But her voice was a harsh, venomous hiss in my ear. She told me to sign the paper right now. She whispered that I better not embarrass them, you pathetic loser. I stood there holding the heavy silver pen. I looked down at the documents. I saw the blank signature line waiting for my name. I looked up at DeAndre, who was standing on the other side of the table. He was watching me with absolute hawkish intensity. His eyes darted to his pocket, reminding me of the sniper he thought was still aiming a rifle at my husband's chest. He gave me a sharp, nearly imperceptible nod, ordering me to finish the transaction. I looked at Keisha, who was already stepping back to pose for the photographs, anticipating her imminent millions. Finally, I looked out at the crowd of 300 VIP guests. I saw the mayor. I saw the pastors. I saw my mother beaming with pride. The air in the room felt incredibly thick and heavy with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the final stroke of the pen. They were waiting for me to surrender my legacy and fade into absolute obscurity. I held the pen over the dotted line. I let my hand tremble just enough to make it look entirely convincing, and then I simply opened my fingers. The heavy silver fountain pen slipped from my grasp. It hit the polished mahogany table with a loud, sharp clack that echoed through the microphone. It rolled rapidly across the smooth surface off the edge of the table and plummeted to the floor. It bounced against the wooden stage and rolled straight off the platform, landing somewhere in the shadows near the front row of the audience. A sudden, uncomfortable silence fell over the massive banquet hall. The flashing cameras stopped. Keisha let out a sharp, audible gasp of irritation. Her perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She shot me a look of pure murderous rage, clearly thinking my emotional distress was ruining her perfect moment. She knelt down in her expensive couture gown, desperately trying to see where the pen had fallen. DeAndre's jaw clenched visibly. The charming mask slipped, revealing the violent panic underneath. He took a threatening step toward me, his eyes wide with silent, furious warning. He thought I was panicking. He thought I was breaking under the pressure of the sniper threat. He reached into his velvet tuxedo jacket, preparing to pull out his phone and send the execution order to the man on the roof. But I did not cower. I did not apologize for dropping the pen. I completely ignored the documents on the table. Instead, I took two deliberate, confident steps away from them and walked directly to the center of the stage. I reached out and grabbed the microphone firmly from its metal stand. I looked out over the sea of confused faces in the audience. I stood entirely straight, shedding the slumped posture of the defeated victim. I locked eyes with my mother, who was suddenly sitting rigidly in her chair, sensing the profound shift in my energy. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice did not shake. It rang out through the speakers crystal clear and entirely steady, commanding the attention of every single person in the room. I told the crowd that I would love to sign the acquisition documents. I said $25 million was an incredible valuation for the company I built from nothing. I paused, letting the words hang in the silent air. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at DeAndre. I offered him a cold, razor-sharp smile that made the blood completely drain from his face. I leaned back into the microphone and told the audience that before we finalized this historic family transaction, I wanted to do something special. I announced that as a tribute to my brother-in-law's absolutely brilliant business mind and to my sister's unwavering loyalty, I had prepared a short video presentation. I pointed toward the ceiling at the back of the room. The technicians in the control booth, completely unaware of the true nature of the video, executed the cue I had given them earlier that evening. The massive crystal chandeliers hanging over the banquet hall dimmed to a soft, low glow. The gentle hum of machinery echoed above us as a massive white projector screen slowly descended from the vaulted ceiling right behind the main stage. DeAndre stopped reaching for his phone. He pulled his hand out of his jacket and quickly smoothed his velvet lapels. His massive, fragile ego immediately took over, overriding his violent paranoia. He genuinely thought this was a tribute. He thought I had compiled a slideshow of his fake philanthropic achievements, or a video highlighting his real estate empire to justify his control over my company. He puffed out his chest and smirked, looking out at the mayor and the city council members fully prepared to soak in the public adoration. Keisha stood up, adjusting the bodice of my stolen wedding dress, and walked over to stand beside her husband, eager to share the spotlight. The banquet hall was completely silent. 300 influential guests held their breath, waiting to see the celebration of Black excellence DeAndre had promised them. The bright bulb of the high-definition projector mounted in the balcony flared to life, casting a brilliant beam of white light across the dark room. The beam hit the massive white screen behind us. DeAndre smiled, his brightest, most charismatic smile, ready for the applause. But the expected montage of corporate success and family photos never appeared. There was no upbeat music. There was no glowing tribute to his fake legacy. Instead, the massive screen flickered violently, emitting a loud, sharp burst of static that made several guests in the front row jump in their seats. The bright white light collapsed instantly. The screen flickered one more time and then went completely pitch black. The trap was sprung. The silence in the room transformed from polite anticipation into a heavy, suffocating tension as everyone stared at the massive black void, waiting for the truth to finally be revealed. The massive black void of the projector screen hung over the silent room for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers, mounted along the vaulted ceilings, crackled to life. There was no upbeat music or introductory narration. There was only a voice. It was deep, resonant, and dripping with absolute venomous arrogance. It was DeAndre's voice, recorded in crystal-clear, high-definition audio just 10 minutes ago in the isolated corridor. His recorded voice echoed through the massive banquet hall, telling me I had absolutely no idea how brilliant his operation was. The crowd of 300 elite guests instantly froze. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. DeAndre physically jolted backward on the stage as if he had been struck by lightning. His charismatic, philanthropic smile vanished entirely. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a velvet tuxedo. He reached into his pockets, frantically searching for his phone, but the audio was not coming from his device. It was coming from everywhere. His voice boomed through the speakers, bragging about how he did not just forge a few documents. The entire congregation listened in stunned silence as the recorded DeAndre explained how my sister Keisha sat at his dining room table for 3 agonizing weeks, practicing my signature until it was absolutely flawless. I watched my mother Shirley sitting at the VIP table in the front row. Her jaw literally dropped. The expensive glass of champagne she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The audio continued without mercy. The speakers blasted DeAndre's explicit confession, detailing how he set up 7 different shell companies registered in Delaware, specifically designed to look like boutique floral and catering vendors. He bragged loudly to the entire church about funneling dirty cartel cash through those shell companies directly into my business accounts. He laid out his master plan to route the clean money straight to his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, while leaving my name and my social security number on every single primary ledger. The wealthy wives who had been whispering about my pathetic failures just minutes earlier were now staring at the stage with wide, terrified eyes. The mayor of Atlanta, who had just shaken DeAndre's hand and accepted a massive novelty check, suddenly stood up from his chair. The politician's face was pale with sheer panic. He immediately signaled to his security detail. He knocked his chair backward and practically sprinted away from the front table, desperate to distance himself from a man who had just confessed to laundering money for a violent criminal syndicate on a live microphone. But the audio was not finished. The recording reached the climax of our confrontation in the hallway. DeAndre's dark, vicious laugh echoed through the holy sanctuary. His voice vibrated with absolute malice as he told me the cartel did not care who went to federal prison as long as their money was clean. Then came the final, devastating blow. The speakers broadcast his ultimate threat loud and clear. He told me to smile for the cameras and sign the sale papers tonight, or my husband's brains would paint the motel wall. A collective gasp of absolute horror ripped through the massive banquet hall. Several women screamed, covering their mouths in shock. Church elders clutched their chests, entirely horrified by the sheer demonic cruelty of the man they had just praised as a pillar of the community. Before DeAndre could even attempt to shout over the speakers or claim the audio was fake, the visual evidence hit. The massive black projector screen suddenly flashed a blinding white light. A high-resolution photograph of the master ledger filled the screen. It was the physical book Darius had risked his life to photograph at the construction site. Bright red digital circles appeared on the screen, highlighting the forged signatures and tracing the exact routing numbers directly to DeAndre's personal offshore accounts. Then the image shifted. A grainy but unmistakable video clip began to play. It was security camera footage retrieved from a local bank branch. The timestamp in the corner showed a date from 2 months ago. The footage clearly showed Keisha wearing a designer trench coat and oversized sunglasses sitting across from a bank manager. The camera angle caught her perfectly as she slid the sunglasses down her nose. It was undeniably my sister. The footage showed her handing over the fraudulent loan documents and signing my name with practiced, effortless precision. The visual proof was absolute and entirely undeniable. The illusion of the Golden family was completely obliterated in front of the entire city. Keisha lost her mind. The pristine, elegant facade she had maintained her entire life violently shattered. She looked at the massive screen showing her committing federal bank fraud, and a high-pitched hysterical scream ripped from her throat. She did not look like an angel in a custom couture gown anymore. She looked like a trapped feral animal. She grabbed the sides of my stolen, altered wedding dress, hiking the expensive silk fabric up above her knees. She sprinted off the stage, completely abandoning her husband and abandoning her poise. She ran frantically down the center aisle of the banquet hall, pushing past terrified guests and knocking over a tray of champagne glasses. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding that someone turn the projector off. She lunged wildly toward the raised technological control booth at the back of the room. She clawed at the heavy wooden door of the booth, trying to rip the cables out of the wall with her bare, manicured hands. But the door was locked tight from the inside, secured by the undercover federal agents who were running the broadcast. Keisha pounded her fists against the reinforced glass, sobbing and screaming like a lunatic, while the entire elite society of Atlanta watched her absolute degradation. On the stage, DeAndre realized his empire was gone. The $25 million, the Cayman Islands, the pristine reputation, it all vanished into thin air in less than 2 minutes. He was entirely trapped. There was no elegant corporate spin that could explain away a high-definition recording of him threatening to have a sniper execute a man. The humiliation was absolute, and for a narcissist like DeAndre, public humiliation was a fate far worse than death. His eyes darted wildly around the room, watching his wealthy friends backing away from him as if he were carrying a deadly plague. Then his frantic gaze locked onto me. I was standing just a few feet away from him, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely cold and unbothered. I was the dark-skinned sister he thought was entirely beneath him. I was the woman he thought he had perfectly manipulated and destroyed, and I was the one who just orchestrated his total annihilation. Something deep inside DeAndre's mind snapped. The calculating businessman was replaced by a man consumed by blind, violent rage. He let out a guttural roar of pure hatred. He reached behind his back, sliding his hand under the tailored hem of his velvet tuxedo jacket. He bypassed his phone completely and grabbed the cold, heavy steel tucked into the waistband of his trousers. He ripped a sleek black handgun from his waist and raised it in the air. The reaction in the banquet hall was instantaneous and chaotic. The murmurs of shock immediately erupted into deafening screams of pure primal panic. 300 people scrambled for their lives. Men in expensive tuxedos dove under the dinner tables, pulling their wives down to the floor. Chairs crashed against the marble tiles. The string quartet dropped their expensive instruments and sprinted toward the kitchen exits. Total, absolute pandemonium swallowed the grand room. My mother Shirley screamed my name from the front row. It was not a scream of warning. It was a scream of sheer disbelief as she watched her perfect son-in-law aim a loaded weapon directly at her own daughter's chest. DeAndre stepped toward me, his hands shaking violently with adrenaline and fury. The barrel of the gun was pointed squarely at my heart. His eyes were completely unhinged, devoid of any reason or sanity. He screamed over the chaos that I had ruined everything. He yelled that if he was going down, he was taking me straight to hell with him. I did not run. I did not dive under the mahogany table. I stood my ground looking straight down the dark hollow barrel of his weapon. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I refused to let him see me cower. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to make this toxic family comfortable. I was done shrinking. I looked him dead in the eyes and waited for the inevitable. DeAndre braced his stance. His jaw clenched and his finger tightened visibly around the trigger. But before the heavy firing pin could strike, before the bullet could tear through the cheap olive green fabric of my dress, a massive, deafening crash echoed from the back of the hall. The sound was so loud, it momentarily drowned out the screaming crowd. The towering, heavy stained glass doors at the main entrance of the banquet hall were violently kicked open with explosive force. Shards of thick, colorful glass rained down across the polished marble floor. Dozens of federal agents in heavy tactical gear poured through the shattered entrance like a tidal wave of absolute authority. The blinding beams of high-powered tactical flashlights cut through the dim, romantic lighting of the banquet hall, crisscrossing over the terrified faces of the elite guests. The agents fanned out with terrifying military precision, securing every single exit and blocking the doors to the kitchens. They shouted in booming, commanding voices, ordering everyone to stay down and keep their hands visible. The wealthy politicians, the real estate moguls, and the church elders all dropped to the marble floor, pressing their expensive suits and designer gowns into the spilled champagne and shattered glass. Walking directly through the center of the heavily armed tactical team was a man who commanded the attention of the entire room. It was Darius. He was no longer the exhausted, beaten laborer hiding in the freezing rain. He was not wearing a cheap neon safety vest or a soaked gray shirt. He was wearing a sharp, flawlessly tailored midnight black Tom Ford suit. The crisp white collar of his shirt contrasted sharply with his dark skin, and his posture was completely rigid with fierce, unyielding determination. He looked exactly like the elite, brilliant financial mastermind I had married. The bruised and battered man from the muddy construction site was completely gone, replaced by an absolute force of nature. His dark eyes immediately locked onto me standing on the stage, and then his gaze shifted to DeAndre. He saw the heavy steel handgun pointed directly at my chest. DeAndre was completely distracted by the explosive breach at the back of the room. His violent focus wavered for a fraction of a second as he turned his head toward the shouting federal agents. He swung the barrel of the gun away from me, aiming it blindly toward the incoming officers. That single moment of hesitation was all the opening my husband needed. Darius did not wait for the tactical team to clear the path. He broke into a full sprint, sprinting down the center aisle of the church hall with explosive speed. He vaulted effortlessly over a fallen mahogany dining table, sending crystal centerpieces crashing to the floor. DeAndre turned back toward the stage, his eyes widening in sheer panic as he realized who was charging at him. He tried to raise the weapon again, but he was too late. Darius launched himself onto the wooden stage and tackled DeAndre with brutal, bone-crushing force. The impact of their bodies colliding sounded like a car crash. DeAndre was a massive man, but the sheer adrenaline and protective fury surging through Darius made him entirely unstoppable. They crashed hard against the polished wooden floorboards of the stage. The heavy steel handgun was knocked violently from DeAndre's grip, skittering across the stage and dropping harmlessly into the front row of the audience. Darius pinned DeAndre to the floor, driving his knee sharply into the center of DeAndre's back. He grabbed the collar of the velvet tuxedo, twisting it tightly, and shoved DeAndre's face hard against the rough wood. Before DeAndre could even attempt to struggle or throw a punch, half a dozen federal agents swarmed the stage. They pulled Darius back gently but firmly, stepping in to take control of the physical threat. Two massive agents grabbed DeAndre's arms, yanking them painfully behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the microphone, which was still resting on its stand nearby. An agent grabbed DeAndre by his velvet lapels and hauled him to his feet. The charming, arrogant real estate mogul was completely gone. His custom tuxedo was ruined, his face was bruised, and his eyes were wide with the terrifying realization that his life was officially over. A federal agent began reading him his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, ensuring the mayor, the city council, and every single wealthy investor in the room heard exactly what DeAndre was being charged with. He was explicitly arrested for federal wire fraud, money laundering, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. At the exact same time, on the other side of the room, another squad of federal agents had located Keisha. She had failed to break into the technological control booth and was desperately trying to crawl out through a side exit near the coat check. Two female agents intercepted her, grabbing her forcefully by the arms. Keisha fought them like a feral animal. She kicked her expensive heels into the air and thrashed her body wildly, screaming that they had the wrong person. She screamed that she was the interim chief executive officer and demanded to speak to her lawyers. The agents did not care about her demands. They dragged her back into the main banquet hall, forcing her to walk past the horrified stares of her affluent social circle. As she struggled, the delicate hand-stitched French lace of my stolen wedding dress snagged violently on the sharp metal edge of a fallen catering table. Keisha yanked forward and the fabric tore with a loud, sickening rip. The beautiful shimmering champagne silk split entirely up the side, exposing the cheap synthetic lining underneath. The dress she had stolen and altered to psychologically torture me was completely destroyed, reflecting the exact state of her pristine fake life. The agents forced Keisha to her knees right in front of the main stage. They pulled her manicured hands behind her back and slapped the cold steel handcuffs onto her wrists. She collapsed forward, sobbing hysterically. Her expensive designer makeup ran down her face in thick black streaks, making her look entirely pathetic. I stood on the stage watching the people who had tormented me finally face their absolute ruin. But the nightmare of my family was not quite finished. A loud, piercing shriek cut through the authoritative commands of the federal agents. It was my mother. Shirley scrambled up from the floor, entirely ignoring the broken glass cutting into her hands. She did not look at me. She did not run to the stage to see if I was unharmed after having a loaded weapon pointed at my heart just seconds ago. Her entire universe still revolved exclusively around her golden child. Shirley ran frantically toward the agents holding Keisha down. She threw herself between the heavily armed officers and her sobbing daughter, waving her arms frantically. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to physically shield Keisha from the federal authorities. She pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at me, standing silently on the stage. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing through the massive hall. She screamed that Keisha did not know anything about the cartel money. She yelled that it was all a massive mistake. She told the federal agents they were arresting the wrong sister. She pointed at me again, her face twisted into a mask of pure venomous hatred. She screamed she didn't know. Maya set her up. Arrest Maya, she's the jealous one. The absolute hypocrisy and delusion of her words hung heavily in the air. Even after hearing the high-definition audio of DeAndre explicitly confessing that Keisha spent 3 weeks practicing my forged signature, my mother still chose to protect her. Even after watching security footage of Keisha committing federal bank fraud, my mother still blamed me. She was willing to throw me to the federal government and let me rot in a prison cell just to maintain the illusion of Keisha's perfection. The entire congregation watched in stunned, disgusted silence as the true, deeply toxic dynamic of our family was laid bare for the world to see. The lead federal agent in charge of the raid stepped forward. She was a tall, striking black woman, radiating absolute authority. It was my college sorority sister. She walked right up to my mother, towering over her with a look of profound disgust. She did not yell, but her voice was as cold and sharp as a razor blade. She told my mother to step away from the federal suspect immediately, or she would be placed under arrest for obstruction of justice and aiding a criminal conspiracy. My mother physically recoiled as if she had been slapped. She looked at the hardened federal agent and finally realized her manipulative tears and her church-sanctioned guilt trips held absolutely no power here. She stumbled backward, covering her mouth with her hands, as she finally understood that Keisha was not going home tonight. My sorority sister turned away from Shirley, dismissing her entirely. She walked up the wooden steps to the stage and approached me. Her stern professional expression softened for just a fraction of a second, offering me a silent nod of deep respect. She asked me quietly if I was injured. I shook my head, telling her I was perfectly fine. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a thick, pristine legal folder. It was the heavily guarded dossier containing the final pieces of Darius's brilliant financial counterattack. She handed the folder to me, ensuring it was securely in my grasp. The federal operation was complete, but my personal reckoning had just begun. I took the heavy folder and held it tightly against my chest. I looked across the stage at Darius, who was standing tall, his breathing finally returning to normal. He gave me a gentle, reassuring smile, acknowledging that the hardest part was over. I turned my attention back to the floor below the stage. I slowly walked down the 3 wooden steps, my cheap olive green dress brushing against the expensive polished wood. I walked directly toward the center of the room, where Keisha was sobbing on her knees in handcuffs and my mother was standing frozen in shock. I stopped right in front of them, towering over the 2 women who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. The federal agents stepped back slightly, giving me the space I needed to finish what they had started. The entire banquet hall was dead silent, watching me hold the legal folder. The final hammer was about to fall, and I was not going to show them a single ounce of mercy. I stood in the center of the shattered banquet hall. The silence was absolute. 300 of Atlanta's most elite citizens held their breath. They watched me hold the heavy legal folder. I looked down at my sister. Keisha was kneeling on the cold marble floor. Her hands were cuffed tightly behind her back. The stolen champagne silk of my wedding dress hung in ragged, torn strips around her bruised knees. Thick black mascara mixed with her tears, staining her face and completely ruining her flawless complexion. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. For the first time in her entire life, she was looking at me not with condescension, but with absolute raw fear. I slowly flipped open the heavy cover of the legal folder. The crisp sound of the thick parchment paper rustling echoed in the quiet room. I looked right into Keisha's panicked eyes. I kept my voice perfectly calm and measured. I asked her if she really thought an international hospitality conglomerate based in London was going to swoop in and buy my company for $25 million. I reminded her of the phone call she secretly listened to from my office. I told her I knew she was eavesdropping. I said I knew she would be so blinded by her own insatiable greed and her desperate need to escape her cartel debt that she would never actually bother to verify the buyer. Keisha's breath hitched. Her chest heaved violently as the horrifying realization began to dawn on her. I told her she was right about one thing. There really was a massive acquisition finalized this week. But the buyer was not a group of anonymous British investors. I turned slightly and pointed my hand toward the main stage. I told Keisha I wanted to formally introduce her to the chief executive officer of the private equity fund that just purchased all of their assets. Every eye in the banquet hall followed my hand. They looked at Darius. He stood at the edge of the stage, looking down at the woman who had tried to destroy his marriage. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom Tom Ford suit, his expression radiating absolute icy control. I looked back down at Keisha. I told her she and DeAndre had made a fatal miscalculation. They looked at my husband and saw nothing but a man from the wrong side of the tracks. They thought because he was quiet and kind, he was weak. They forgot that before he ever put on a dirty safety vest to haul cement in the pouring rain, he was one of the most ruthless and brilliant financial analysts in the city. I explained exactly what Darius had been doing for the last 3 months. I projected my voice so the mayor, the politicians, and my mother heard every single word. I said Darius did not just spend his time working as a lowly laborer to find the physical ledger. By day, he was sweating in the red mud, but by night he was meticulously tracing every single one of DeAndre's sloppy digital footprints. He tracked the shell companies. He tracked the offshore routing numbers. And most importantly, he tracked DeAndre's massive, staggering legitimate debt. DeAndre was a fraud long before he ever got involved with the cartel. He had taken out massive high-interest loans from private banks to fund his lavish lifestyle and his failing commercial properties. He had leveraged absolutely everything to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. I told Keisha that Darius formed an anonymous holding company. He used his elite industry connections and his extensive knowledge of the market to approach those private banks. The banks knew DeAndre was defaulting, They considered his loans to be entirely toxic assets. So Darius bought up every single one of DeAndre's defaulted notes for pennies on the dollar. My mother Shirley let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the sidelines. She clutched her pearl necklace, staring at me in total disbelief. I pulled a thick stack of watermarked documents from the legal folder. I let them fall from my hands. The papers fluttered down through the air, landing directly on the marble floor right in front of Keisha's knees. They were not fake vendor contracts. They were certified bank notices. They were repossession orders. They were official property deeds. I looked at Keisha and delivered the complete and total reversal of our fortunes. I told her we did not just save soulful heritage events from her filthy hands. I said we used the holding company to execute our rights as the primary lien holders of their defaulted debt. I told her we now legally owned everything. I pointed to the shattered glass doors at the entrance. I told her the fleet of luxury sports cars and the immaculate silver Mercedes parked in the valet lot were already being loaded onto flatbed tow trucks by federal asset forfeiture agents. I told her the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely frozen, and the domestic accounts had been entirely drained to satisfy the outstanding bank debts that we now controlled. Then I delivered the final crushing blow. I looked at the torn, ruined fabric of my stolen wedding dress clinging to her body. I told her she no longer had a home to go back to. I said the deed to her sprawling $4 million mansion in Buckhead, the house she used to host her lavish parties and look down on the rest of the world, was now officially registered in my name. I told her she was completely and legally bankrupt. She had absolutely nothing left, zero. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The sheer magnitude of their financial ruin shocked the wealthy crowd into a stunned, breathless silence. On the stage, DeAndre finally processed the full scope of his defeat. He realized he was not just going to federal prison for the rest of his life. He was going to prison as a completely penniless, humiliated fraud. And the people he hated most in the world now owned his entire kingdom. He snapped. He let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. It was the sound of a massive, fragile ego being completely pulverized into dust. He thrashed wildly against the federal agents holding his arms. He kicked his expensive Italian leather shoes against the wooden floorboards, screaming my name. He screamed that he was going to kill me. He screamed that I could not take his money. But the agents showed no mercy. Two massive tactical officers grabbed him by the back of his collar and his belt. They physically lifted him off the ground. DeAndre kicked and thrashed and spat like a wild animal as they dragged him violently off the stage. They hauled him down the center aisle of the church, pulling him straight through the shattered stained glass doors and out into the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting in the parking lot. His furious screams faded into the humid Atlanta night until they were entirely gone. With her husband dragged away and her entire fortune completely erased, Keisha finally broke. The arrogant, entitled golden child completely shattered into a million pathetic pieces. She fell forward, leaning over her handcuffed wrists until her forehead pressed against the cold marble floor. She sobbed with loud, ugly, heaving gasps that echoed terribly in the quiet banquet hall. She wriggled her knees across the spilled champagne and the broken glass, crawling awkwardly toward me. She looked up, her face twisted in absolute desperation and fear. The woman who had spent my entire life calling me dark, ugly, and worthless was now looking at me as her only savior. She begged me. She pleaded with a high-pitched, trembling voice. She asked me to tell the federal agents to let her go. She cried that she could not go to prison. She said she would give me anything I wanted. She promised she would never bother me again. She tilted her head up and looked into my eyes, using the one word she thought would somehow magically erase 34 years of relentless abuse. She called me her sister. She said, "Please, Maya, we are family. You are my sister. You cannot do this to your own sister." I looked down at her pathetic kneeling form. I thought about the night she sat in my dining room drinking my wine and smiling while she handed me fake divorce papers. I thought about the power of attorney she forced me to sign while her husband threatened to murder the man I loved. I thought about the decades of emotional torture, the colorism, the gaslighting, and the sheer cold-blooded malice she had inflicted upon me without a single ounce of remorse. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The bond of blood between us had been burned to ashes a long time ago. I looked down at her ruined face. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but it cut through the silence of the room like a freshly sharpened blade. I told her I do not have a sister. I turned my back on Keisha, leaving her sobbing hysterically on the marble floor, surrounded by the evidence of her own destruction. I did not look back as the female federal agents hauled her roughly to her feet and dragged her out of the banquet hall to face her federal charges. The ultimate sweet revenge was finally complete, and I was walking away completely free. As the heavy, shattered doors of the church closed behind the federal agents, taking Keisha away, the immense silence of the room returned. The remaining elite guests were frozen in their places, too stunned to even whisper or move. I stood in the center of the wreckage, breathing in the cool air, drifting through the broken glass. Then I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of heels approaching me from behind. I turned around to face my mother. Shirley was trembling from head to toe. The diamond necklace around her neck, which she had proudly flaunted just an hour ago, suddenly looked like a heavy chain weighing her down. She looked at the empty doorway where Keisha had just disappeared, and then she looked at the legal folder still resting firmly in my hands. The reality of her situation finally crashed down upon her. With Keisha and DeAndre going to federal prison and their entire estate legally seized, Shirley had absolutely nothing. The luxury condo she lived in was paid for by DeAndre's shell companies. The car she drove was leased under Keisha's name. The credit cards in her designer purse were completely tied to the fraudulent accounts that federal agents were currently freezing. She was entirely destitute in a matter of minutes. She reached out a shaking hand trying to grasp my arm, but I took a deliberate step back. Her face crumpled into a mask of pure desperation. She dropped her arrogant, haughty attitude and adopted a sickly sweet, pathetic tone. She dropped her voice to a whimpering whisper. She said, "Maya, baby, you have to take care of me. I am your mother. You cannot just leave me here with nothing. Where am I supposed to go?" I looked at the woman standing before me, and I felt a profound sense of absolute closure. I looked at the woman who had spent 34 years systematically dismantling my self-esteem. I looked at the mother who had constantly belittled the dark shade of my skin and mocked the natural texture of my hair, comparing me to a sister who was willing to forge my name and send me to prison. I remembered how she sat at my dining room table and smiled while pushing fake divorce papers into my hands. She had happily participated in a plot to destroy my life because she truly believed I was entirely expendable. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority that made her flinch. I told her that for my entire life I had begged for her approval. I had worked myself to the bone trying to build a company she could be proud of, trying to be the daughter she wanted. But I finally realized that her love was entirely conditional and completely transactional. I looked right into her tear-filled eyes. I told her she had placed all of her bets on the wrong daughter. I said, "You made your choice, Shirley. Enjoy the streets." She let out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the church. She fell to her knees right in the spot where Keisha had been sobbing minutes earlier. She cried out my name, begging me to come back, but I did not stop. I turned my back on her and walked straight toward the edge of the stage where Darius was waiting for me. He reached out and took my hand, interlocking his fingers firmly with mine. Together we walked out of the banquet hall, stepping over the shattered stained glass, leaving the toxic ruins of my family behind us forever. 6 months later, the warm evening breeze of the Atlanta summer drifted across the massive wrap-around balcony of our brand-new corporate headquarters. I stood leaning against the sleek glass railing, looking out over the glowing city skyline. The nightmare of that charity gala felt like a distant lifetime ago. Soulful Heritage Events was no longer just a local luxury brand. We had expanded our operations nationwide, opening regional offices in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. With Darius managing the complex financial acquisitions and me driving the creative vision, we had built an unstoppable empire. I heard the soft slide of the glass patio door opening behind me. Darius stepped out onto the balcony holding two crystal champagne flutes. He looked incredibly handsome, wearing a casual tailored linen shirt. The bruises and cuts from the construction site had long since healed, leaving only a faint scar above his eyebrow as a permanent reminder of the war we fought and won together. He handed me a glass and wrapped his free arms securely around my waist, pulling me close against his chest. I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling a sense of deep, absolute peace that I had never known before. We were healing. We were wealthier than we had ever been. But most importantly, we were completely, fiercely, and unconditionally in love. I looked out at the vibrant city lights and thought about the journey that brought me to this exact moment. I turned my gaze back to you, the people watching and listening to my story right now. If there is one thing I want you to take away from everything I survived, it is the absolute realization of your own unshakable worth. We are taught from a very young age that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned to believe that we owe our families endless loyalty, even when they offer us nothing but endless pain. But let me tell you the hardest truth I ever had to learn. Sometimes the family you are born into is the exact thing you need to survive walking away from. You do not owe your peace to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You do not owe your success to people who secretly pray for your downfall. And you absolutely do not owe your love to anyone who makes you feel like you are difficult to love simply because of the color of your skin or the boundaries you set to protect your spirit. Breaking generational curses is not a quiet, peaceful process. It is a violent disruption of the status quo. It requires you to look the people who hurt you directly in the eyes and strip them of their absolute power over your life. It means accepting the terrifying reality that the people who are supposed to protect you are actually the ones you need protection from. I had to lose everything I thought I knew about my family to discover the incredible unyielding strength I carried inside myself. I had to let my old life completely burn to the ground so I could build my true authentic empire from the ashes. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own sanity? Have you ever had to break a generational curse to find your own success? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Let this space be a safe testament to our shared resilience. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving, overcoming, and thriving against all odds. Share this video with anyone who might need the courage to finally choose themselves today. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a part of my healing journey. Remember, your worth is never determined by those who are completely incapable of seeing it. I turned back to Darius. He smiled, looking at me with nothing but pure absolute adoration. We raised our crystal glasses under the twilight sky. The sharp, clear sound of the glass clinking together rang out into the beautiful open air, marking the absolute perfect ending to a beautiful new beginning.